In this lecture, our last lecture on eyewitnesses, we're going to talk about estimator variables or witness factors. Up until now, we've been talking about system variables, and these are variables that are part of the system, and these are things that we can change and make better to make eyewitness identification better. So we can change lineup procedures, not give post-identification feedback, etc., etc. Now we're going to be talking about estimator variables that we can't change. These are factors that are part of the witnessing situation. And as such, there's nothing we can do about it. There's nothing we can do about the factors that are present here. At best, what we can do is estimate. This is why they're called estimator variables. We can estimate the degree to which the eyewitness identification is correct based on some of these factors that were present in the crime itself. So you'll start to see what I'm talking about in just a few minutes. We learn about these factors and then we try to figure out whether or not these factors came into play in this particular situation. So let's take a look at the first factor. It's an obvious factor, which is age. As you might guess, people who are quite a bit older or quite a bit younger are less reliable as witnesses. So for example, older eyewitnesses, people more than 60 years of age, are more prone to making false choices during identifications than younger adults. And of course, this is sort of linear. I mean, you wouldn't expect that much of a difference between somebody who's 60 versus maybe 25. That might be a slight difference, but if your witness is 70 or 80 or even as old as my mother is, my mother just turned 94, and you would expect that as the person gets older, the more unreliable they will be. That doesn't mean that they're not correct. It's just a factor to take into account. Children also are less reliable, and children, the age that people typically talk about it as being, a point at which the reliability goes down is less than 10. So that when you're asking children 3 and 4 years of age to testify or pick people out of a lineup, you have to be a little bit more careful. Of course, that doesn't mean that children as young as 3 can't be accurate witnesses, or that somebody who's 90 couldn't be an accurate witness. It's just something to consider. Okay? Another factor that's important, a witness factor, is exposure duration. As you might guess, the longer the exposure to the perpetrator, the more accurate the identification. You're going to watch us in this week's lectures. There's a little short news clip, and they show you a crime in which you really do not get a very good chance to look at the perpetrator. And so you would predict that in crimes where you don't get a very long look, it's going to be much harder to pick out the perpetrator in a lineup. So the longer you have to spend time looking at the perpetrator, the more likely you are to be accurate. But there's a slight twist to this, because the longer you have, it also makes you more confident that you've made the right choice, even when that's not true. If you remember, Jennifer, one of the things that she mentioned was the fact that she had spent so much time with Bobby Poole and studied him so carefully that actually made her more confident that she got the right person. And we all know that she didn't get the right person in the lineup. So while having a more exposure leads to better identification, it also might lead to the sort of double-edged sword that you've got a witness that's maybe more confident than they should be. Okay, we're going to look at, before we talk about the next witness factor, I'm going to give you another chance to be an eyewitness. Now, this is a short film that was put together by the students at the University of Texas at El Paso, and so the quality in the acting isn't great, but I'm going to give you one last chance to pick someone out of a lineup. Okay, so here is a bake sale.
Hello, how's the bake sale going? Having some lot of food today?
Oh yeah, we've had a great turnout this year.
I saw a big line a few minutes ago. That must have been a good time.
Yes, today has been our most successful day. We made over $200.
Wow, that's great. I guess I'll contribute to the cause and vote or something.
Great, we have a big section of cakes, brownies, and drinks. Just take your pick.
What kind of soft drinks do you have? Do you have any Diet Coke?
Let me go check. I think we just sold our last Diet Coke 10 minutes ago. I'm sorry, we're fresh out of Cokes. Can I have you something else?
I'm sure I'll have a cupcake, a cookie, and a bottle of water.
Your total comes out to $5.75.
Do you have change for a 20? That's the smallest bill I got.
Yes, I have change. I'll be right back with your food and drink.
Thanks a lot. Take your time.
Okay, so what do you think? We have pretty good exposure here, exposure time. You had a chance to kind of look at the person's face. So let's do a lineup. I'm going to give you a simultaneous lineup, which of course we know I shouldn't do, but I will caution you that the perpetrator may not be in the lineup. So take a look at these faces and tell me who you think the perpetrator is, or if this is the perpetrator's not in the lineup. So you've looked at the faces. I don't know how long it took you to figure out one way or the other, but in this particular lineup, the perpetrator is in the lineup. Does anybody know who he is? Number 6. Okay. Okay. Well, that was your last chance to be a witness. I don't know how well some of you did, but in this particular lineup and in this particular situation, the perpetrator is Hispanic, and so it brings us to another witness variable, which is the race or ethnicity of the victim and the defendant. As I mentioned before in a previous lecture, numerous studies show that participants, are better able to recognize own race faces versus other race faces. And so, again, in the Cotton and Thompson case, Jennifer was white and her perpetrator was African American. And so her mistaken identification may have been partially due to the fact that she was doing a cross-race identification. So we have lots of studies that show that we have this bias, but the question is, why? Why do we have this bias? What causes this bias to happen? And there are many hypotheses about why we might have this race bias in identifying people from different races or ethnicities. One of the hypotheses is the interracial contact hypothesis. What this suggests is that the amount of contact that you have with members of the other group will predict how well you do in terms of picking them as an eyewitness. So in other words, if you live in a very diverse community and you have a lot of exposure to people of different races or ethnicities, then you might be better. There is some evidence for this. For example, there was one study that was done of adult Koreans who were adopted as children by Caucasian families. So these were children who are Korean but were adopted very young, at a young age, by white families. And they compared them to Korean adults who were raised in Korea. And so, of course, they had them witness a situation and then pick out same or other race faces. And what they found was that the adult Koreans who were adopted were very good at picking out white faces in lineups, whereas the Koreans who grew up in Korea did a very poor job. So just having contact with different groups might make you better. By the way, racial attitudes don't predict your ability to pick out other race faces. It really does seem to be, it's the amount of contact and the amount of chances that you've had to study different faces. Another hypothesis is the cognitive disregard. By the way, all of these hypotheses have some support for them, so it's probably a combination of both. The cognitive disregard hypothesis, this is building on what we know about human cognition, and that people tend to reserve cognitive resources. So if you don't have to process something too deeply, you won't. You're kind of lazy. Okay, all of us are kind of lazy. And the cognitive disregard hypothesis suggests that it's much more important for you to learn how to recognize in-group members people of your own race and ethnicity than it is to recognize outgroup members because you spend less time with them. And so what you tend to do is disregard people and information about outgroup members. So it's not, so this hypothesis suggests that even if you get a lot of exposure through interracial contact, you might still not be as good with other race faces because you disregard them. And there's this tendency to regard in-group members as part of your identity, and so you'll spend more time looking at them. Okay? Another hypothesis has to do with encoding. What that hypothesis suggests is that we tend to encode the features when you're looking at a face. What kinds of things do you look at in order to differentiate that face from other faces? And the idea here is that maybe because for example, if you're talking about white faces, what kinds of features are important for what to distinguish white faces? What you often have when you look at people, what they look at when they look at a face. When white people look at white people, they often tend to look at hair color. So you see them looking at hair, looking at the eyes, okay? Other features that might be important are the texture of the hair. Is it curly? Is it straight? Those are the features that might be really helpful in differentiating one white face from another white face. However, those features might be less diagnostic for another race. So for Black participants who look at other Black faces, they may look at different features. So they may look at pay more attention to the color of the skin. So, when we talk about African Americans, there's a huge range of skin color. And so skin color is very diagnostic. They may look at studies have shown that African Americans looking at other African Americans spend more time looking at the nose, okay, than white people do. So the point of this hypothesis is, it's not that we disregard other races, it's just that we use we're looking at the wrong features. So they're less diagnostic. So if I was the victim of a crime and the perpetrator was African American, looking at their hair doesn't really help me very much. Eye color probably doesn't help me very much. So I'm looking at less diagnostic features. The last hypothesis is called the differential cognitive processing hypothesis. And there's a lot of support for this hypothesis as well. What the differential cognitive processing hypothesis suggests, and it fits in a little bit with the cognitive disregard hypothesis. What it suggests is that we process same race faces differently than we process other race faces. And there are these findings that when you look at your faces from your own race, you tend to process the face more holistically. So you look at sort of the distance between features, and you don't look at just the eyes and the nose and the mouth, but you look at the whole face. On the other hand, there's lots of data that shows that when you look at other race faces, you tend to be more featurely processing. So you're processing eyes, nose, ears, mouth separately. So a feature process. And by the way, if you're wondering how in the world did you figure something like this out? There's some very clever studies that look at this. So for example, if you see a face of your own race, for example, in a testing situation, and so we give you a series of faces, but then in the recall situation, what we do is we don't give you the faces right side up, but we turn them upside down. It turns out that really messes up your ability to figure out whether you've seen that face before, if it's somebody from your own race. And the reason is because you processed it holistically, and so it's hard to spin that face around. On the other hand, if you're doing other race faces, turning the face upside down doesn't impair your ability to figure out whether you've seen that face before. And that's because even upside down, you can look at features. So those are the hypotheses, and there's evidence for all of those. Okay, here's another witness factor, and that's the weapon focus. And we know that witnesses who are confronted with a weapon tend to focus on the weapon rather than the perpetrator's face. So, I mean, the weapon is the source of danger. And so the victim tends to spend more time looking at the weapon and where that weapon is and what it's doing than looking at the person's face. And of course, having done that, they're less likely to recognize the face in the lineup. So weapon focus is another witness factor. The final witness factor has to do with confidence. I think I've mentioned a couple of times that confidence is a weak predictor of eyewitness accuracy. In fact, there's practically a zero correlation between confidence and accuracy. And so it is a factor that differs from witness to witness, but it doesn't really predict anything. Now, I just want to give you one exception to that, one exception to the rule. There is this finding in the literature, and we call it the 10 to 12 second rule. The 10 to 12 second rule describes certain eyewitness experiences. So, for example, there are some eyewitnesses that come to their decision like within 10 to 12 seconds. So this is typically more like a simultaneous lineup. What they do is like within 10 to 12 seconds, they say, it's number 2. Those witnesses tend to describe a sort of a feeling that the perpetrator just pops out of the lineup. I mean, it was so obvious to them. It's number 2. And they tend to be also very confident. So they're fast and they're confident in their decision. And it's that combination of quickness and confidence, and it does actually predict accuracy. 90% of people, when they have that combination of extreme confidence and extreme quickness, are actually accurate in their choices. Now, I just want to mention, though, that this is not a typical eyewitness experience. Most eyewitness experiences are much slower, and so then you need to be concerned. But if you have somebody that does that so quickly and is completely confident, it is much more likely that they are also accurate. Okay? So before we end, though, I've just gone through the witness factors, but I just want to mention the reason why eyewitnesses get so much attention is because they are very convincing. We know that jurors are more likely to convict when an eyewitness is present. And as we've looked at the Innocence Project, a huge proportion of the falsely accused and falsely convicted people were convicted on the basis of eyewitness identification, which tells you that juries believe eyewitnesses. Also, we know that juries don't know about the problems that eyewitnesses have. They don't know about system variables. They don't know about witness variables. And so they think eyewitnesses are pretty accurate. Also, in a jury trial, they don't get to hear about eyewitnesses who didn't identify the suspect. So, for example, in the Dando trial with the killing of Jill Dando, the jurors were not told that 3 of the 4 witnesses initially couldn't even identify Barry George out of a lineup. And so they're not aware that these witnesses at some earlier time were very wishy-washy, or it took them 30 minutes to pick out the witness. And so the perpetrator. So they are not aware of it. They're not aware of eyewitness problems, and they have a lot of confidence in eyewitnesses. So the question is, what do you do to get jurors to be a little bit more aware of some of the problems that eyewitnesses can pose? Well, the most typical thing that you do now is you get an expert testimony. So the expert can then educate the jurors about things that could lead to errors in eyewitness ability. So the expert might say, well, there was post-identification feedback in this particular case. Here's what we know about post-identification feedback. And so what you do is have an expert come in and educate the jury. Well, the studies that have looked at the use of expert testimony have found that, and these are mock juries, these are experiments, that when jurors are told about some of these problems, they tend to spend more time discussing these problems when they're deliberating. So having an expert present testimony gives jurors something to talk about in terms of whether or not this eyewitness testimony is accurate or not. It also tends to lower the believability of the eyewitness. So they're much more skeptical of eyewitnesses than when they don't get an expert witness. And we see that it decreases convictions when there are eyewitness problems. And this is really important. You don't want to just decrease convictions overall, so that what the expert has done is just maligned all eyewitness testimony. You want the jurors to be aware of which problems are important. So, for example, it's a cross-race identification, there was post-identification feedback, and the lineup was unfair. Given all those problems, now I'm concerned. So you don't want people just to be across the board distrusting eyewitness testimony. And it does seem to suggest that the expert can give jurors important information that they can use when those factors are there. Now, I just want to mention also one other thing that's been used is cautionary instructions. And these are instructions that the judge gives. So the judge then instructs the jury to be careful, tells them something about eyewitness testimony, and sometimes you get that instead of experts. Unfortunately, most of the research shows that cautionary instructions from judges tend to be not as helpful. And it's probably because judges' instructions often use a lot of legal jargon, and so it's hard for jurors to really understand what the judge is doing. Now, before I end, I just want to mention one thing. You know, I've talked to you before about how psychology and law as a discipline has had an impact on how we do things in this country. And I think you can see this very clearly from the expert testimony. We've changed the way we do things with regard to witnesses. And just to show you how far we've come, I'm going to share with you here on August 24th, 2011, the court had to deal with a case that had to do with eyewitness testimony. And what they did was they asked for all the research, and they spent a lot of time looking at it and came out with some recommendations. Now, I just want to point out some things about what they say. Look at what the wording that they're using. It says, among the court's findings on system variables, look, they're using our terms, are the following: where the identification procedures are administered by someone who knows the identity of the suspect, there is increased likelihood of misidentification. Feedback by administrators affects the reliability of identification and should be avoided. And the record casts doubt on the reliability of show-ups. I haven't talked about show-ups, but show-ups are when a crime is committed, you say, oh, it was a 6'2" man with a blue hoodie, and the police go wandering around the neighborhood. They find a guy that matches the description, cuff him, stick him in the car, and then drive him over to you and say, is this the guy? That's a show-up, okay? Or single person lineups conducted more than 2 hours after the event. Okay, so they're using our language. Regarding some of the estimator variables, again, our language. The court finds that the reliability of an identification can be affected by high levels of stress on the eyewitness, when the interaction is brief, the presence of a visible weapon, cross-racial recognition, and witness interaction with non-state actors like co-witnesses and other sources of information. In addition, the studies generally reveal generally that people do not intuitively understand all the relevant scientific findings. As a result, there's a need to promote greater juror understanding of those issues. Look at this. This is the Supreme Court in New Jersey. And this is what they held. Given the information, the current legal standard for assessing eyewitness identification evidence must be revised because it does not offer an adequate measure for reliability, does not sufficiently deter inappropriate police conduct, and overstates the jury's ability to evaluate identification evidence. 2 modifications to the standard are required. First, when defendants can show some evidence of suggestiveness, all relevant system and estimator variables should be explored at pretrial hearings. In other words, if you have a situation where some of these things were done, you could ask for a pretrial hearing, present that evidence, and those witnesses may not be able to testify in court. Second, the court system must develop enhanced jury charges on eyewitness identification for trial judges to use. Defendant is entitled to a new pretrial hearing consistent with this opinion to determine the admissibility of the eyewitness evidence introduced at his trial. So this was a decision in that particular case. So their second thing that they're saying is better jury instructions by the judges. Now, I just told you that judge instructions are not that great, but the court is willing to try, and so we should try to develop jury instructions that a judge can deliver that would be helpful for jurors. So that's something that you see a lot of researchers doing right now, trying to develop judge instructions that are helpful and do educate the jurors. Okay, so we have made an impact. Before I leave, I just want to show you, we've talked to the Thompson case, the Ronald Cotton case, mentioned something about compensation for false convictions, and that comes up a lot. So I just want to show you in this website that shows the different compensation rates for different states for wrongful convictions. And it's always interesting to me when you compare different states. So, and it's not always in the direction that you predict. So, for example, if you look at Colorado, it's $70,000 per year for wrongful imprisonment plus $50,000 for each year served while sentenced to execution. Okay, so more if you're it's a death penalty case, and so forth and so on. California has $140 per day of wrongful imprisonment. Okay, and again, by the way, there are instructions you have to file within a certain amount of time, so that's something that you need to know. But I find that states are not necessarily as I would predict. For example, Delaware has no statute at all, so there is no post-conviction compensation. States that you might think would be very stingy, let me just go down here. I don't mean to make you dizzy, but let's go down to Texas. Texas is known to be a very punitive state, and yet they allow pretty decent compensation, $80,000 per year of imprisonment, okay, and $25,000 per year for any year spent on parole or registered as a sex offender. So this is even crediting you with anything that you had after you got out of prison. So a much more generous compensation package than you would predict just knowing something about the state. How's Wyoming do? I think you all know, because I think I've mentioned this before, we have no statute either. So there is no compensation for anyone who was exonerated for a false conviction. So that's it for what we have here on Eyewitnesses. And next week we'll start by looking at lie detection, interrogations, and confessions.